To what extent are the ways of knowing ultimately reliant upon memory? The ways of knowing guide our thought processes and therefore are at the core of our lifestyle choices. One of the more prominent ways of knowing is memory. Memory is defined as the faculty by which the mind stores and remembers information. This definition is very brief and does not fully capture the vast extent of the influence that memory holds. Each of the other ways of knowing is dependent upon recollection. However, there are two exceptions to this, which are sense perception and intuition. These two ways of knowing are independent and can function without utilizing memory. On the other side, though, language, emotion, reason, imagination, and faith can all be traced back to this way of knowing, showing that a working memory provides the building blocks for interpreting knowledge. An efficient memory is often underrated and not fully appreciated in most people's everyday lives. The majority of us use our powers of simple recall all the time without even realizing it. While those of us who have this ability do not always acknowledge the extensive power of memory, those who are deprived of a working memory are more likely to realize its impact because they feel the effects in their everyday lives. A common cause of this lack of memory is called Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's is a type of dementia that causes problems with memory, thinking, and behavior. Symptoms usually develop slowly and get worse over time, becoming severe enough to interfere with daily tasks. The risk factor of developing the disease increases with age and is seen most in elderly people, though it is sometimes found in late 40s and 50s. While most people know or assume that Alzheimer's affects the ability to perform simple recall, the lack of memory bleeds over into other cognitive abilities. Common symptoms include difficulty thinking and understanding, delusion, apathy or anger, jumbled speech, and general discontent. In this case, it is proven that memory is also affecting the patient's emotions, reason, and language. However, the extent of memory can also be analyzed and concluded to affect imagination and faith as well. Language is the first and most obvious way of knowing that is affected by memory loss. Language is simply the ability to communicate through speech or other systems, and speech is reliant upon our ability to remember how to formulate certain sounds with our mouths. Therefore, it makes sense that patients with Alzheimer's, with a problematic memory, cannot efficiently say some phonetic sounds and struggle with certain words. This is a very simple but necessary human ability, and without it can cause the patient to feel very isolated. Emotion is affected by memory in that emotions are just a response. There are feelings of joy or sorrow, but these emotions do not usually just arise out of thin air. They are due to one's responses to their surroundings, like a promotion at work would probably cause a feeling of elation, or a death in the family would cause grief. Now, in order for us to respond to these different stimuli, the knowledge must be taken in through our senses, but past that, the information must stick in our brains through our nervous system's ability to send signals through neurons, or in other terms, transmit and maintain the knowledge. When this happens, we remember the piece of information that sparked an emotion, and whatever that emotion was will remain and be felt until new information is discovered or the stimuli just fades into irrelevance. Therefore, if a working memory is not intact, this knowledge can be forgotten and the emotions will disappear just like the information did. This is especially prevalent in short-term memory loss patients, as they often don't remember what happened in the very recent past and do not know how to feel about it. In the application to Alzheimer's disease, this is exemplified in the common symptom of being apathetic, or feeling no interest in anything, because there is no recollection of what might cause the emotion. On the other hand, there are cases of war veterans frequently showing signs of depression and aggression, showing that not being able to forget bad experiences like war can affect one's emotion long term. There are numerous other causes for emotion, such as hormones, but there is no arguing that memory holds a major influence over our emotions. Reason is also one of the more obvious ways of knowing affected by memory. Reason is just using the laws of logic that have been gathered based upon the universally consistent, unspoken rules that guide the world. This guides what we deem appropriate to do and say, and allows us to determine what is probable and likely. People remember these universal world and social rules, usually subconsciously, in order to react according to society at least, quote-unquote, normal. When Alzheimer's patients cannot perform the task of recalling the laws of logic, they can have trouble understanding certain concepts and can have certain delusions falling under the symptom of confusion. Imagination is dependent upon memory, but in a more complex way. Imagination is defined as forming mental images or concepts of what is not actually present to the senses. However, the ideas created through imagination must come from somewhere, as everything is, at least to an extent, a reaction from something else. Because of this, imagination in the sense where something entirely new is created from no previous basis of knowledge does not exist. Therefore, if the cause of imagination is not from your senses, it must be from your previous understanding of the world, or whatever it is that you remember. From using your previous memories or knowledge, you can then imagine new ones. Though some may argue that imagination can cause brand new ideas to spark, this is not entirely true. For example, as kids, we often use Legos to build elaborate contraptions. In this instance, our memories and previous pieces of acquired knowledge are the individual Legos. When you put them together, they can create something previously completely unknown, such as a brand new building. At the end of the day, though, this Lego masterpiece was only possible through our ability of recollection. Faith is the last way of knowing that is under the jurisdiction of memory. Faith is hard to explain as is and cannot really ever be justified. However, in order for faith to exist, one must first have something to have faith in. A very common example of faith in action is the institution of religion. Many self-proclaimed Christians have faith in Jesus Christ and God, but this only stemmed from the teachings of the Bible. Ever since the rise of Christianity, people have been living their lives based upon this religious text, which requires a good deal of memory. Without a memory, you would not remember whatever it is you have faith in, and the confidence or trust would dissipate. As previously mentioned, there are two distinctive ways of knowing that do not fall under the influence of memory. The first of which is rather obvious, sense perception. Sense perception is when we utilize our five senses to take in information. It is the start of practically all formulation of knowledge, just as observing is one of the first few steps in the scientific method. One must have a chance to intake knowledge in order for anything to be mentally digested. Once sense perception has occurred, from here the other ways of knowing will begin to interpret it. Regardless, it is strictly physical, while memory exists entirely in our mental faculties. The second way of knowing that is completely independent and can function without being altered by the ability to remember things is intuition. Intuition is defined as pure and untaught knowledge without reasoning or consciousness. In other words, people describe intuition as the things you know without any type of explanation. It is almost the exact opposite of science because science is purely dependent upon evidence and proof, while intuition requires none of this support. However, the accuracy of intuition is limited by its lack of justification, as sometimes people's gut feelings are incorrect and misguiding. On the other hand, though, intuition walks hand in hand with instincts, and that they are both inexplicable forms of information. One frequent example of the necessity of instincts is migratory patterns of animals. Without this practice, many animals would not reproduce in the right areas and the whole ecosystem would be thrown off balance. It is independent from memory because it is ultimately a separate way of knowing all on its own. With memory, it is all about the accumulation of previous knowledge, while with intuition, it is knowing stuff despite the lack of previous knowledge. Overall, my conclusion that memory affects the majority of the other ways of knowing is very significant because even though memory has such an influence, there are still many different diseases that deal with memory deterioration that are without cures. Memory is underrated because many people do not realize the extent of the difficulties that memory loss means. Because of this, memories are taken for granted. Even past the specific influence of memory, as humans, we must analyze not only our ways of knowing, but also how they interact with each other. It is by looking at how they overlap and in some cases overshadow each other that can explain our actions. Because we use each one every single day, we should acknowledge the fact that they make us who we are and grant us the ability to think and function. Therefore, we should look both externally for how the ways of knowing interact in the world around us, as well as look internally for how our individual ways of knowing interact to see whether or not we are giving each way of knowing enough credit, especially in the case of memory.